Thursday morning at the Clark House on 1247 Corridor Avenue began as usual. David Clark sat at the kitchen table, reading the local newspaper, the Norfolk Daily News, and sipping coffee from his favorite mug with the Cornhuskers logo. At 48, he looked his age. His hands were calloused from 25 years as a mechanic at Greater Omaha Packing. His gray hair was neatly combed back, and his slight belly betrayed a love of beer after work. "The Johnsons are selling their house," he said to his wife, without looking up from the newspaper. "They're asking $120,000. That's crazy." Susan stood at the stove, cooking eggs. At 45, she had retained her attractiveness. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her nurse's uniform was perfectly ironed. 12 years working in the emergency room at Faith Regional Health Services had taught her how to cope with stress. But today, there was something in her movements that betrayed her anxiety. "Times are changing, Dev," she replied, flipping the eggs. "Remember when we bought this house for $70,000? The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both look up. Norman was coming down slowly, unsteadily. Tall and thin, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders. He looked younger than his 19 years. In recent months, something had changed in him. His gait had become more cautious, his gaze evasive, and his clothes strange. "Good morning," Norman muttered as he walked to the refrigerator. David looked up from the newspaper, frowning. His son was wearing a pink t-shirt he hadn't seen before, and jeans that seemed too tight. His hair looked styled. "What's that shirt?" his father asked. "Just a t-shirt," Norman replied, taking milk out of the refrigerator. "A pink t-shirt," David clarified, closing the newspaper. "Where did you get that?" Susan sensed the tension and quickly intervened. "Breakfast is ready. Sit down at the table." They ate in relative silence. David kept glancing at his son, noticing details that had previously escaped his attention. Norman's nails were clean and well manicured. Did his eyebrows look trimmed? And was that lip gloss? "Any plans for today?" Susan asked, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm meeting with Dr. Hansen," Norman replied without looking up from his plate. "Again?" David frowned. "You saw him last week. Did something happen?" Norman hesitated. He had been seeing Dr. Hansen, a psychologist, for the past few weeks, but he had told his parents it was related to his career choice and college applications. In reality, the visits were for something else entirely. "Just talking about the future," he muttered. David finished his breakfast and stood up. "Well, I have to get to work. We're getting a shipment of new equipment today." He kissed his wife on the cheek and headed for the door. "See you tonight." After he left, Susan and Norman were left alone. His mother stared at her son for a long time, trying to understand what was going on. "Norman, we need to talk," she said quietly. He looked up and she saw fear in his eyes. "About what, Mom?" "About what's been happening to you lately. The clothes, the visits to the psychologist. I'm worried." Norman put down his fork. His hands were shaking. He had been preparing for this conversation for months, rehearsing what he was going to say, but now he had forgotten everything. "Mom, I need to tell you something. Something important." Susan moved closer. She had seen a lot of family drama in the hospital, and her maternal instinct told her that something serious was about to happen. "I'm listening, dear." "I don't feel like a man." The words burst out, as if he was afraid he would change his mind. "I feel like a woman. I always have, and Dr. Hansen is helping me understand that." Silence hung in the air. Susan looked at her son, trying to make sense of what she had heard. In her years working at the hospital, she had encountered all kinds of people, but she never thought something like this would happen to her own family. "What does that mean?" she finally asked. "It means I'm transgender, Mom. I'm a woman born in a man's body, and I want to be myself, the real me." Susan felt the world begin to spin. "And what do you want to do?" "I want to start transitioning. Change my name to Norma. Maybe start hormone therapy. Dr. Hansen says it's normal that there are people who—" "Wait," Susan raised her hand. "Wait, this is very serious, Norman. Do you understand what this means? What will your father say? What will people say? I know it's hard." Norman's voice grew more confident. "But I can't pretend anymore. I can't live a lie." Susan stood up and paced around the kitchen. Her medical training told her that transgenderism was a recognized condition, but her mother's heart was breaking with pain and fear. "What if it's just a phase?" she asked. "Maybe you just need some time." "Mom, this isn't a phase. I'm 19 years old and I've felt this way since I was a child. Remember how I asked you to buy me dolls? How I wanted to wear your dresses? You said it was normal for little boys, but for me it was more than just playing." Memories flooded back to Susan. Norman had indeed been different as a child. He had been gentler, more sensitive. David had constantly tried to make a man out of him, taking him to football, teaching him how to fix cars. But the child had always seemed unhappy. "Norman, I'm sorry. This is so hard for me," she said, sitting back down. "I love you, you know that, but I need time to process all this." "I understand, Mom, and I'm not asking you to accept everything right away, but I need your support, especially when we tell Dad." At the mention of David, Susan's face paled. "Oh God, what are we going to tell your father?" "The truth," Norman replied. "He'll find out sooner or later." "You don't understand," Susan shook her head. "Your father is a very traditional man. Family is sacred to him. Masculinity is the foundation of his worldview. But he's my father. He has to love me for who I am." "Has to doesn't mean can." Susan took her son's hands. "Let me talk to him first. Prepare him." Norman nodded, but deep down he knew that talking to his father would be the most difficult test of his life. When David returned from work that evening, he immediately noticed the strange atmosphere in the house. Susan was unusually quiet at dinner, and Norman didn't come down to eat at all, claiming he had a headache. "What's going on?" David asked, putting down his fork. "We need to talk," his wife replied. "It's about Norman." "What about him? More problems at college?" "No, Dave. It's more complicated than that." Susan told her husband about the morning's conversation, trying to find the right words. She saw David's face change from bewilderment to shock, from shock to anger. "What nonsense?" he exploded when she finished. "My son is a man. I raised him to be a man. Dave, please." "No!" He slammed his fist on the table. "It's all those psychologists, the internet, liberal propaganda. They're brainwashing our children. That's not how it works." "How does it work, Susan? Explain it to me." David stood up and began pacing the kitchen. "I've raised my son for 19 years, taught him to be a man, and now he comes to me and says he wants to be a girl? He didn't choose this, Dave. This is who he is." "Who is he?" David turned to his wife. "He's my son, my only son, and I won't let him ruin his life because of some stupid fantasy." At that moment, Norman entered the kitchen. He had heard the shouting and decided it was time to face reality head-on. "Dad," he said quietly. David turned around. For the first time, he really looked at his son, at his long hair, his feminine features, his posture, which was not at all masculine. "You." His voice was full of pain and anger. "How could you? How could you do this to me?" "Dad, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm just trying to be myself." "Yourself?" David moved closer. "Who are you? Are you my son or not?" "I'm your child, Dad. Just not the one you wanted me to be." There was a long silence. 3 people stood in the kitchen, each feeling that their family would never be the same again. 2 weeks had passed since the evening when the truth came out, and the house on Corridor Avenue had turned into a Cold War battlefield. David hardly spoke to Norman, limiting himself to short phrases about everyday things. At breakfast, he read the newspaper as if it were a shield between him and the reality he refused to accept. That morning, David got up earlier than usual. He hadn't slept for several nights in a row. He sat in his workshop in the garage, mindlessly sorting through his tools and trying to understand where he had gone wrong as a father. On the workbench lay photographs. Norman at 6 with a baseball bat, at 10 fishing, at 15 next to the first car they had repaired together. In all the pictures, the boy looked unhappy, but David hadn't noticed it then. "Dave?" His wife's voice made him turn around. Susan stood in the garage doorway in her robe, a mug of coffee in her hands. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair tousled. Her job at the hospital required emotional stability, but at home she could no longer maintain her professional composure. "Couldn't sleep," he muttered, not looking up. We need to talk. What is there to talk about, Susan? My son is crazy, that's all. She entered the garage and closed the door. He's not crazy. I've researched this. Transgenderism is a recognized medical condition. A medical condition? David finally looked up. Are you saying it's a disease? Not a disease, a difference. There's research, treatment protocols. Treatment? He jumped up. So it can be cured? Susan shook her head. Not cured, helped. Help people live in harmony with who they are. Who is he, Susan? Tell me who my son is. She took a deep breath. Possibly your daughter. The word daughter felt like a slap in the face. David turned away and punched the workbench. No, I don't have a daughter. I have a son, and I won't let him ruin his life. Dave, please. You know what? I'll talk to the pastor. Tom Wilson is a wise man. He'll help us figure this out. Pastor Thomas Wilson had served at First Union Methodist Church for 15 years. At 58, he was a pillar of the Norfolk religious community, a tall, gray-haired man with kind eyes and a soothing voice. The Clarks attended his church irregularly, but David and Tom had been friends since school. When David appeared in his office at the church, the pastor immediately knew that something was seriously wrong. They sat in a simple room with wooden furniture and pictures of Bible scenes on the walls. Tom, I need your help, David began, wringing his baseball cap in his hands. It's about Norman. Pastor Wilson listened silently, nodding from time to time. When David finished, he was silent for a long time, thinking about what he had heard. This is a difficult trial for your family, he said finally. Trial? David leaned forward. Tom, this isn't a trial. It's a disaster. My son thinks he's a woman. And what does Scripture say about loving our children? Scripture also says that God created us male and female. In His own image, He created them. Male and female, He created them. Pastor Wilson nodded. That's true, but it also talks about love, forgiveness, and understanding. So you think I should accept this? I think you should pray, and maybe try Christian counseling. There are professionals who help people dealing with these kinds of issues. You mean reparative therapy? Therapy based on biblical principles. Dr. Kevin Myers in Omaha is a good Christian and an experienced psychologist. He might be able to help Norman find the right path. David felt hope for the first time in 2 weeks. Do you think it will work? With God's help, anything is possible, Dave. But you have to approach this with love, not anger. Meanwhile, at home, Norman was preparing for another visit to Dr. Hansen. The psychologist was the only person with whom he could openly discuss his feelings. Dr. Hansen's office at the medical center on Norfolk Avenue had become his refuge. Dr. Richard Hansen, a man in his 40s with a beard and kind eyes, specialized in working with LGBT+ youth. He had moved to Norfolk from Denver a year earlier, realizing that conservative areas of the Midwest were in particular need of professionals willing to help transgender people. How are things at home? He asked as Norman settled into the chair opposite him. It couldn't be worse, he replied. My dad barely talks to me. My mom tries to keep the peace, but I can see how hard it is for her. How do you feel? Norman paused. Honestly, for the first time in my life, I feel like I can be myself. When I'm alone in my room, I put on the women's clothes I bought in secret. I look at myself in the mirror and I see Norma. Tell me about Norma. She's happy. She's not trying to be someone else. She just exists. Norman's voice softened. I want to start hormone therapy, Dr. Hansen. I'm ready. The psychologist looked closely at his patient. Norman, do you understand that this is a serious step and that your family may react even worse? I understand, but I can't wait any longer. I'm 19 years old. I'm an adult. I have the right to make decisions about my body. Technically, yes, but emotionally, you're still dependent on your family. Where will you live if they kick you out? How will you pay for therapy? Norman lowered his head. He hadn't thought about these practical issues. I'll find a way. Maybe I'll get a job, rent an apartment. That won't be easy in Norfolk. Everyone knows everyone here. Are you prepared for the whole town to talk about your transition? The thought was frightening, but Norman nodded. Better to be myself and face condemnation than to play a role my whole life. That evening, David returned home with a new resolve. He told Susan about his conversation with the pastor and the suggestion to see Dr. Myers. Reparative therapy? Susan frowned. Dave, that's a controversial method. Many experts consider it ineffective and even harmful. What do you suggest? Let him ruin himself with hormones? I suggest we listen to the experts. Real experts, not people who are trying to fix something that may be normal. Normal? David raised his voice. You call that normal? At that moment, Norman entered the living room. He was wearing the same pink t-shirt he had worn 2 weeks ago, but now David noticed more details. His eyes were lined, his lips were glossy, and he had earrings in his ears. What's that? He pointed to the jewelry. Earrings, Norman replied calmly. When did you get your ears pierced? Last week. David felt the blood rush to his face. Without our permission? I'm 19, Dad. I don't need permission. You live in my house. Dave, calm down, Susan intervened. No, I won't calm down. Look at him. David pointed at his son. That's not my child. My son would never look like that. Your son never existed, Norman said quietly. All that existed was the mask I wore to please you. Those words sounded like a death sentence. David stood there, breathing heavily, trying to control his anger. We're going to see Dr. Myers, he said finally. Tomorrow. I'm not going to some quack who's going to try to fix me. You're going because you're my son and you live under my roof. What if I refuse? There was a heavy silence. David looked at the child he no longer recognized, and Norman stood with his chin raised, ready to fight for the right to be himself. Then you can find another place to live, his father said quietly, but each word sounded like a blow. Susan gasped. Dave, you can't. I can. This is my home and I won't stand by and watch my son turn into this. Norman felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Fine, but know this. If I leave, I'm not coming back. Then you won't. They stood facing each other, father and child who no longer understood each other. Between them lay a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The next day, Norman didn't go to Dr. Myers. Instead, he met with Dr. Hansen and told him what had happened. I think I really need to start looking for a job and a place to live, he said. I can't live with this tension anymore. Are you sure you're ready to take that step? No, Norman replied honestly, but I have no choice. If I stay, I'll either go crazy or my dad will kill me. The word kill sounded like a joke, but Dr. Hansen frowned. He had seen how family conflicts over LGBT+ issues could escalate into tragedy. Norman, if you feel threatened... No, he said quickly. My dad wouldn't hurt me physically. He just can't accept it, and I understand him. He dreamed of a son who would take over his business, get married, and give him grandchildren. Instead, he got me. You're not to blame for who you are. I know, but that doesn't make it any easier. Dr. Hansen leaned back in his chair. What if we try family therapy? Sometimes a neutral setting helps people hear each other. Norman shook his head. My dad would never agree. To him, you're part of the liberal propaganda too. Meanwhile, David did make an appointment with Dr. Myers in Omaha. But he went alone. Norman, as promised, refused to go. The psychologist's office was located in a Christian center, its walls decorated with Bible quotes and images of the cross. Dr. Kevin Myers, a man in his 60s with stern features, listened to David's story and nodded understandingly. Unfortunately, this is becoming an increasingly common problem, he said. Modern culture imposes ideas on our children that are contrary to the natural order of things. So it can be fixed? With God's help and the right approach, yes. But the child has to want to change. Coercion rarely works. What if he doesn't want to? Dr. Myers shrugged. Then you'll have to make a difficult decision. Sometimes tough love is the only way to save a lost soul. David returned home even more convinced that he was right. He was ready to fight for his son's soul, even if it meant war. A month later, the house on Corridor Avenue was a war zone. David and Norman barely spoke, communicating only through Susan, who felt like a diplomat in a war zone. Every morning began with tension and ended with silent confrontation. That morning, David sat at the kitchen table, aggressively flipping through the newspaper. His job at the meat processing plant had become his only refuge. There he could focus on simple, understandable things: repairing equipment, replacing parts, solving technical problems. No one there questioned his masculinity or the correctness of his views. "Good morning." Susan placed a mug of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. He nodded without looking up. In recent weeks, he and his wife had barely spoken. He thought Susan was too soft on Norman's problem, and he felt like he was the only one trying to save the family from destruction. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both tense. Norman was coming down slowly, clearly not wanting to see his father. Over the past month, he had changed even more. His hair was longer and styled in a more feminine way. His movements were smoother, and his clothes were now openly feminine. David looked up and froze. Norman was wearing a blouse, not a t-shirt, but a real women's blouse in a pale blue color. Skinny jeans, and were those women's shoes? "What is this?" His voice sounded hoarse. "Good morning, Dad." Norman walked over to the refrigerator, trying not to look at his father. "I asked what this outfit is." "Clothes," Norman replied, taking out some juice. David stood up so abruptly that his chair fell over. "Those are women's clothes!" "So what? So what?" David moved closer. "You're dressed like a woman?" Norman turned around. "Yes, because I am a woman." "You're a man! You're my son!" "No, Dad, I'm your daughter, and the sooner you realize that, the better for everyone." The word "daughter" sounded like an explosion. David grabbed Norman by the shoulders and shook him. "Stop it! Stop this game!" "Dave!" Susan rushed to separate them. "Let go! This isn't a game!" Norman broke free from his father's grip. "I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of being someone I'm not." "Then stop! Take off those ridiculous clothes and act normal. This is normal. For me." David was breathing heavily, trying to control his rage. Fine. We're going to settle this right now. Get ready. We're going to see Dr. Myers." "I already told you, I'm not going." "You're going, or get out of my house." "Dave, please." Susan stepped between them. "Let's talk calmly." "What is there to talk about?" David pointed at Norman. "Look at him. He's lost touch with reality." "I've found a connection to reality," Norman said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I feel real." "Real?" David laughed bitterly. "You think wearing women's clothes makes you a woman? You have a man's body." "For now," Norman replied, his voice filled with determination. "But that can be changed." There was a dead silence. David stared at his son, unable to believe what he was hearing. "What do you mean?" Norman took a deep breath. He had been preparing for this conversation for weeks. "I started hormone therapy." If the room had been silent before, now it was dead. Susan turned pale and David seemed frozen. "What?" he whispered. 2 weeks ago I started taking estrogen, under a doctor's supervision." "What doctor?" David's voice became dangerously quiet. "Dr. Patel in Omaha. She specializes in helping transgender people." David slowly sat down on a chair, as if his legs had given way beneath him. "You're taking female hormones?" "Yes." "Without our consent?" "I'm 19. Consent isn't required." Susan sank into the chair next to him. As a nurse, she understood what hormone therapy meant. It wasn't a game or an experiment. It was a serious medical intervention with irreversible consequences. "Norman," she said, her voice trembling, "do you understand what you're doing?" "I do. Dr. Patel explained everything. I had a psychological evaluation and tests. Everything is being done properly." "Right?" David finally spoke. "You call this right?" "Yes. You're destroying your body. You're crippling yourself. I'm correcting nature's mistake." David jumped up and began pacing the kitchen like a wounded animal. "Nature's mistake? Nature's mistake? You're my flesh and blood. I created you. You created the body, but not the soul." "What soul?" "You have a male soul, because you're a man." "No, Dad. I have a female soul, and now my body will match it." David stopped and turned to his son. There was pain in his eyes that turned to rage. "How much?" "What do you mean, how much? How much does it cost? These hormones?" Norman hesitated. "About $200 a month." "Where did you get the money?" "I got a job. At a cafe on Norfolk Avenue. And what did you tell them? Are you a man or a woman? I told them the truth, that I'm a transgender woman who's in transition. And they hired you? The manager was very understanding. David laughed hysterically. Understanding. In Norfolk, you found someone who's understanding. What will people say when they find out? Some already know, Norman replied quietly, and most are fine with it. Fine? David grabbed his head. My son works in women's clothing, and that's fine? Your daughter works as a woman because she is a woman. Enough, David exploded. Stop calling yourself my daughter. I don't have a daughter. Then you don't have any children, Norman replied calmly. Because Norman no longer exists. There is only Norma. That was the last straw. David stepped close to Norman, his face contorted with rage. If you don't stop this nonsense right now, if you don't throw away those pills and get back to your normal life, then what? Then I'll make you regret the day you were born. The threat hung in the air. Susan gasped, and Norman paled, but he didn't back down. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. Dave! Susan stepped between them. You're going too far! Too far? He turned to his wife. And he's not going too far? He's taking drugs. They're not drugs, they're medication. That's turning my son into a pervert. Dad, Norman's voice was quiet but firm. I'm not a pervert. I'm just a woman who was born in the wrong body. No! David slammed his fist on the table. No, you're my son, my only son. I won't let you destroy everything I've built. What have you built? Lies? The mask I've worn my whole life? A family, a legacy, a future. What future, Dad? One where I'm miserable every day? One where I play a role until I die? Better to play a role than to become that. Norman shook his head. No, I'm not going to live up to your expectations anymore. He headed for the kitchen door, but David blocked his way. Where are you going? To work, like a normal woman. In those clothes? For the whole town to see? Yes. No. David grabbed Norman by the arm. You're not leaving the house looking like that. Let me go. I won't let you. You'll disgrace the whole family. Dave, stop! Susan tried to pull them apart, but David pushed her away. You're going back to your room and changing into normal clothes. Get off me! Norman tried to break free, but his father was stronger. Dave, you're hurting a child! Child? What child? David dragged Norman toward the stairs. My child is dead! This freak is not my son! Let me go! Norman tried to resist, but David dragged him upstairs and threw him into his room. Change your clothes! Now! No! David entered the room and froze. Women's clothes were lying on the bed. Dresses, blouses, skirts. Cosmetics were on the dressing table. Pictures of women's hairstyles and makeup hung on the walls. What is this? His voice was full of horror. My room, Norman replied, getting up from the floor. David walked over to the closet and threw open the doors. Inside hung only women's clothes. The men's clothes were gone. Where are your normal clothes? I threw them away. I don't need them anymore. Threw them away? David turned around, panic in his eyes. You threw everything away? Yes, because they weren't my clothes. They were the clothes of the person I was pretending to be. David grabbed a dress from the bed and tore it in half. No! Norman screamed. I'll destroy all of this! David began pulling clothes out of the closet. All of this filth! Stop! Those are my clothes! Those aren't your clothes! You're a man! Norman rushed to defend his belongings, but David pushed him away. A scuffle ensued, with the son trying to save what was left of his female wardrobe, and the father methodically destroying every item. Dave! Dave, stop! Susan burst into the room and saw the chaos. Torn clothes, overturned cosmetics, Norman on the floor amid scraps of fabric. Everything! It's all over! David stood amid the destruction, breathing heavily. No more games! Tomorrow we're going to see Dr. Myers, whether you want to or not. I'm not going. Norman got up from the floor, his face wet with tears. You're going? Because if you don't, I'll find that Dr. Patel and tell her you're a minor. I'm an adult. Prove it. Show me your ID. Norman froze. His ID was still in his father's safe, his passport, birth certificate, social security card. You think I don't know where you're getting the money for these hormones? David sneered. I'll call that cafe and tell them my underage son is working illegally. You can't. I can. And I will. If you don't come to your senses. Norman realized he was trapped. Without his documents, he couldn't prove his age. Without a job, he couldn't pay for the hormones. Without money, he couldn't afford a place to live. What do you want? He asked quietly. I want you to stop this game. Throw away the pills. Go back to your normal life. What if I can't? Then we no longer have a son. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Susan cried, pressing her hands to her face. Norman stood amid the ruins of his new life, realizing that his father had given him an impossible choice. You have until tomorrow to decide, David said, heading for the door. Either you go back to being who you're supposed to be, or you get out of my life for good. He left, leaving his wife and child alone with the aftermath of his rage. Norman, Susan whispered, approaching him. I'm so sorry. Don't apologize, Mom, he said, hugging her. It's not your fault. What are you going to do? Norman looked at the devastated room, at the torn pieces of clothing, at the broken bottles of cosmetics. Then he looked out the window at the streets of Norfolk, where he was about to start a new life, or end the old one. I don't know, Mom. I don't know. The next day began with an oppressive silence. David hadn't slept all night, wandering around the house like a lost soul. He aimlessly rummaged through his tools in the workshop, looked through old photographs in the living room, and sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee. His thoughts raced, how his son was turning into a stranger, how everything he had built over the years was falling apart. Susan hadn't slept either. She sat by the bedroom window, watching the dawn break over the quiet streets of Norfolk. In her years working at the hospital, she had seen many family tragedies, but she never thought something like this could happen to her. Norman spent the night gathering what little was left after yesterday's rampage. A small gym bag held 2 t-shirts, a pair of jeans, underwear, and some toiletries. His passport and documents were in his father's safe, but he had $73 in his pocket, all his savings from working at the cafe. In the morning, the family met in the kitchen for the last time. David sat at the table, not touching his breakfast. Susan nervously rearranged the cups. When Norman came down with his bag slung over his shoulder, the air in the room became even heavier. He was wearing his usual white t-shirt and jeans, the only clothes that had survived yesterday's rampage. But his hair was neatly combed, and his face was lightly made up. So, it's final? David asked, without looking up from the newspaper. Yes, Norman replied simply. You realize that without documents, you're nobody? You won't be able to find a decent place to live or go to college. I'll find a way. How? Are you going to sleep in shelters? Norman shrugged. If I have to. Susan couldn't take it anymore. Norman, please, maybe we can find a compromise? Try family therapy? Mom, Dad doesn't want to compromise. He wants me to give up who I am. I want you to come back to reality, David said, finally looking up. Stop this dress-up game. It's not a game. Then what is it? It's my life. David stood up and walked over to the window. You know what I was thinking about all night? About when we used to go fishing when you were little. Remember? You always asked me to throw the fish back. I remember. You said you felt sorry for it. That it had a family too. David turned around. And now you're destroying our family. I'm not destroying the family. I just can't lie anymore. Lie about what? About who I am. Who are you? Norman took a deep breath. A woman. The word hung in the air like a sentence. David stood with his back to his son, his fists clenched. No, he said quietly. You're my son, my only son. Your daughter. I don't have a daughter. Then you don't have any children. David spun around. What did you say? If you can't accept me for who I am, then you don't have any children. Something broke in his father's eyes. Susan saw it and was frightened. Dave, she began. All right, he said in a strangely calm voice. Then go. But know this, if you walk out that door, don't come back. I won't. Norman headed for the door, but turned back at the threshold. Goodbye, Dad. Goodbye, Norman. My name is Norma. To me, you'll always be Norman. The door closed. Susan cried, and David stood at the window, watching his son walk down the driveway toward the gate. Norma walked through the streets of Norfolk, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. She was heading for the bus stop. She needed to get to Omaha, where Dr. Hansen had arranged temporary shelter at an LGBT+ youth center. But the stop was far away, and her bag was getting heavier with every block. Norma stopped to rest near a small park when she heard the familiar sound of an engine. David was driving slowly, looking for his son. He hadn't planned this. He had just gotten in the car and driven off without knowing why. Maybe to make sure he was really leaving. Or maybe he saw Norma by the park and stopped. They stared at each other through the windshield for a few seconds. Then David got out of the car. "Get in," he said. "I'll take you to the bus station." "No, don't." "It's a long walk." Norma hesitated. Logically, she knew her father was right. It was a long way to the bus station. But her intuition told her that something was wrong. "Okay," she finally agreed. They drove in silence. David gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Norma looked out the window at the familiar streets, knowing she was seeing them for the last time. "Dad," she said suddenly, "I know you don't understand, but I still love you." David didn't answer. Thoughts raced through his head. His son was leaving. His family was falling apart. All his dreams were turning to dust. His only child, the continuation of his family line, his hope for the future, everything was disappearing. Instead of turning toward the bus station, he turned onto a deserted road outside of town. "Dad, you're going the wrong way," said Norma. "I know." "Where are we going?" "To the old quarry, remember? We used to go fishing there." Norma became wary. "Why?" "To talk, for the last time." The road became increasingly deserted. No cars, no houses, only fields and scattered trees under the gray Nebraska sky. David stopped the car at the abandoned quarry. He got out and walked around, opening the passenger door. "Get out!" "Dad, I need to get to the bus station." "I said get out!" There was such fury in his voice that Norma was frightened. She got out of the car, clutching her bag. "What did you want to talk about?" she asked. David stood a few steps away, breathing heavily. The wind ruffled his hair. "About how you ruined my life," he said finally. "I didn't ruin it." "You did!" he shouted. "I raised a son for 20 years. I dreamed of grandchildren, of continuing the family line, and you turned into this." "I didn't turn into this. I've always been this." "No, you were a normal boy. I was an unhappy girl in the wrong body." "Enough!" David picked up a rock from the ground, a large, heavy boulder. "Enough of these lies!" Norma stepped back. "Dad, what are you doing?" "What I should have done a long time ago." "Dad, please. If I can't have a son, then there will be no one." He swung the rock. Norma tried to run away, but she tripped and fell. David caught up with her in a few steps. "Dad, no!" she screamed. "I'm your child!" "My child died the day you put on a skirt." The blow landed on the back of her head. Norma fell face down on the ground, blood flowing from the wound. David stood over her, still clutching the rock. "Why?" she croaked, trying to get up. "Why can't you just love me?" "Because you're gone," he replied, and struck again. This time harder. Norma stopped moving. David stood over his daughter's body, breathing heavily. The rock fell from his hands. Slowly, it began to dawn on him what he had done. He had killed her. He had killed his own child. Panic gripped him. He had to do something. Hide the body? No, too risky. Turn himself into the police? But then his life would be over. He looked at the road. It was deserted, but sooner or later someone would come by. He had to leave. Right now. David got into his car and drove back to the city, trying not to speed. Thoughts raced through his head. What would he tell Susan? What would he tell the police when they found the body? How would he explain his son's disappearance? At home, he changed his clothes, threw the blood-stained clothes into the neighbor's trash can, and washed his hands. When Susan asked where he had been, he replied that he had gone for a drive to think. "What about Norman?" she asked. "Did he make it to the bus station?" "Yes," David lied. "I took him there." Susan began to cry. Maybe we should call him? Try to make up? He said he didn't want to see us anymore. It was a lie, but David couldn't stop himself. The body was found 2 days later. A fisherman looking for new fishing spots stumbled upon it near a quarry. The police arrived within an hour. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and graying hair, examined the crime scene. 20 years on the force had taught her to read the signs of violence. "What do we have?" she asked the patrolman. 19-year-old Norman Clark. Multiple head injuries. The murder weapon is a rock lying nearby. Any witnesses? Not yet. It's a deserted area. Have the relatives been notified? Not yet. We wanted to wait for you. Maria nodded. The hardest part of the job was telling parents about the death of their children. An hour later, she was standing outside the house on Corridor Avenue. David opened the door and the detective immediately noticed his nervousness. "Mr. Clark? I'm Detective Rodriguez. May I come in?" "What's happened?" he asked, but there was no surprise in his voice. "I'm afraid I have some bad news. It's about your son Norman." "What's happened to him?" Susan appeared. "I'm so sorry. He was found dead." Susan screamed and fell to her knees. David stood motionless. "Where?" he asked. "At an old quarry outside of town." "Mr. Clark, when was the last time you saw your son?" "The day before yesterday morning. He left the house." "Why?" David hesitated. "Family problems." "What kind of problems?" "He was transgender. We couldn't get along." The detective wrote down the information. "Did you take him anywhere?" "To the bus station." "At what time?" "Around noon." "Any witnesses?" "No, we were alone." Maria looked closely at David. Something about his behavior was alarming. He seemed too calm for a father who had lost a child. "Mr. Clark, I'm going to have to ask you to come to the station to make a statement." "Am I a suspect?" "You were the last person to see the victim alive." David nodded. He knew this moment would come. "Can I say goodbye to my wife?" "Of course." He hugged Susan, who was sobbing. "I'm sorry," he whispered in her ear. "For everything." David stayed at the station for several hours. He answered questions and repeated his version of events. But when Detective Rodriguez told him that witnesses had seen his car at the quarry, he broke down. "I didn't mean to," he said, lowering his head. "I just couldn't let go." "You killed your child?" "Yes." "Why?" David was silent for a long time. Then he looked up, his eyes filled with bottomless pain. "Because it's better to lose a son to death than to lose him to becoming a daughter." The Norfolk Police Department hadn't seen such commotion in years. News of the murder spread quickly throughout the city, and by evening, local journalists and television crews had gathered outside the building. Family murders always attracted attention, but this case was special. It involved a transgender teenager and religious motives. Detective Maria Rodriguez sat in her office studying David Clark's statement. In her 20 years on the job, she had seen many family tragedies, but this one struck her as particularly painful. A father who killed his child because he couldn't accept his gender identity. Cases like this left scars on even the most experienced investigators. "Detective?" Sergeant Thompson knocked on the door. "The suspect's lawyer is here." Maria nodded. David Clark had been assigned a public defender, Michael Harris, a young lawyer in his 30s who had recently moved to Norfolk from Omaha. Cases like this were a serious test for him. Harris met with his client in the holding cell. David sat on a narrow cot, staring at the wall. He had changed dramatically over the past 24 hours. His hair was disheveled, stubble had appeared on his face, and his eyes were empty, like a man who had lost everything. "Mr. Clark, I'm your lawyer," Harris introduced himself. "Michael Harris." David slowly raised his eyes. "I don't need a lawyer. I'm guilty." "That's for the court to decide, not you. Tell me what happened." David told him the whole story, from the moment Norman announced he was transgender to the tragic ending at the quarry. Harris listened, jotting down key points. "Mr. Clark, do you understand that you could face life in prison?" "I understand." "We can try to get the charge reduced, manslaughter in the heat of passion, if we can prove that you were acting in a state of emotional turmoil." "No." David shook his head. "I killed my child. I deserve to be punished." But your family, your wife, needs support. At the mention of Susan, David's face faltered. How is she? She's having a hard time. The funeral is set for Friday. David covered his face with his hands. I can't come. I'm afraid not. You're in custody without bail. Susan Clark sat in the living room of her home, surrounded by friends and colleagues from the hospital. The women brought food and tried to comfort her, but she didn't seem to hear them. In 2 days, she had lost everything, her child and her husband. The house that had once been full of life now felt like a mausoleum. Susan, you need to eat, said Linda Thompson, her colleague from the hospital. I can't, she whispered. How can I eat when my child is dead? Norma wouldn't want you to suffer. Norma, Susan said the name aloud for the first time. I never got used to calling her that. You were a good mother. Was I? If I had been better, maybe I could have prevented this. Linda hugged her friend. It's not your fault. The only one to blame is the person who threw the rock. At that moment, Pastor Thomas Wilson was preparing for one of the most difficult sermons of his career. Sunday service was in 2 days, and the entire congregation was waiting for his words about the tragedy. Many parishioners were divided in their opinions. Some condemned the murder, while others understood David's motives. The pastor sat in his office, rereading the Bible in search of the right words. How could he reconcile Christian love with traditional values? How could he talk about forgiveness when a father had killed his own child? There was a knock at the door. Bob Miller, one of the church elders, entered. Tom, we need to talk, he said seriously. I'm listening. The community is divided. Half consider David a monster, half a victim of circumstances. And what do you think? Bob thought for a moment. I think it's a tragedy, but I also think that we, as a church, could have done more. In what way? We could have been more understanding, more open to dialogue. Instead, we made David feel like he had no choice but to fix his child. Pastor Wilson nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. What do you suggest? Tell the truth about love, acceptance, and how our faith should unite families, not divide them. Meanwhile, Dr. Richard Hansen was preparing for the most painful interview of his career. The local media wanted to hear from the psychologist who had worked with Norma. He understood the importance of this conversation. It could help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Journalist Dan Collins from the Norfolk Daily News met with the doctor in his office. Dr. Hansen, how long have you been working with the victim? About 6 months. Norma came to me during a period of questioning, when she was exploring her gender identity. Can you describe her condition? She was an intelligent, sensitive young person who had been struggling with internal conflict for a long time. Transgenderism is not a choice, it is an innate characteristic. Norma needed support, not attempts to fix her. Did you know about any family problems? Yes, we discussed the difficulties in her relationship with her father. I suggested family therapy, but Mr. Clark refused. Could anything have prevented the tragedy? Dr. Hansen was silent for a long time. Education, understanding, acceptance of the fact that LGBT+ people are God's children just like everyone else. David Clark spent his days in solitary confinement at the county jail. The administration feared for his safety. Child murderers were not popular among inmates. He read the Bible that Pastor Wilson had brought him and wrote letters to his wife that he never sent. Dear Susan, he wrote with a trembling hand, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I know I destroyed our family, but I want you to know that I loved Norman. I loved him so much that I couldn't let him go. That's not an excuse, just an explanation. A month after his arrest, a preliminary hearing was held. David appeared before Judge Margaret Fields, a woman in her 50s with a stern face and gray hair. She had seen many crimes, but family murders always upset her particularly. Mr. Clark, she said, you are charged with first-degree murder. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty? David stood up. Guilty, Your Honor. A murmur went through the courtroom. Attorney Harris tried to intervene. Your Honor, I move to have the plea entered later. My client is in a state of shock. I am of sound mind, David interrupted, and I am guilty of murdering my child. The judge looked at him intently. Mr. Clark, Do you understand the consequences of your plea? I do. In that case, I will schedule a sentencing hearing for next week. Susan was present at the hearing. When her husband pleaded guilty, she cried. Not out of grief. She had cried herself dry a week ago. Out of relief. At least there wouldn't be a long trial that would force her to relive that night over and over again. After the hearing, District Attorney Daniel Smith approached her. Mrs. Clark, I'd like to talk to you about the victim statement. Statement? You have the right to speak in court before sentencing, to tell how the crime has affected you. Susan shook her head. I don't think I can. Think about it. It's important for justice. At home, Susan sat in Norma's room, which she had never cleaned since that terrible night. Torn clothes, broken makeup, everything was left as it was. She picked up a photo of her daughter, one of the few where Norma was smiling genuinely, like a woman. What would you want me to say? She whispered. A week later, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, LGBT+ activists from Omaha, and curious onlookers had all gathered. David sat at the defendant's table in an orange prison jumpsuit, thin and haggard. Judge Fields read the charges and asked if the parties had anything to add. Prosecutor Smith stood up first. Your Honor, this was not just murder, this was a hate crime. A father killed his own child for daring to be himself. Society must see that crimes like this are unacceptable. Attorney Harris objected. Your Honor, my client is not a monster. He is a broken man who acted in the heat of an emotional crisis. He deserves punishment, but he also deserves understanding. Then Susan stood up. She slowly walked to the stand, holding a piece of paper in her hands. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling. I lost the two people I loved most in the world. My daughter was killed by a murderer. My husband killed himself because he hated himself. She paused, gathering her strength. Norma was an amazing child, kind, sensitive, intelligent. Yes, she was transgender. Yes, it was difficult for our family, but she didn't deserve to die for the right to be herself. Susan's voice grew firmer. David did a terrible thing, but I've known him for 25 years. He wasn't a bad man. He was a frightened, confused father who couldn't find it in his heart to love a child who was different from what he expected. She looked at her husband. I can't forgive you for what you did, but I don't want you to die in prison. Norma wouldn't want that. She was always kinder than either of us. The courtroom was silent. Even the journalists stopped writing. Finally, David stood up. May I say something, Your Honor? The judge nodded. I killed the person I loved most because of my own fear and ignorance, he said. Every day I wake up and realize that Norma is gone, that I have robbed the world of a beautiful person, that I have destroyed the life of the only woman I ever loved. His voice broke. I'm not asking for leniency. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want other fathers to know that love has no conditions. If your child tells you who they are, listen, accept them, love them. Because losing a child to death is painful, but losing a child to your own hatred is hell. The judge announced a recess for sentencing. An hour later, she returned. Mr. Clark, you have pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Taking into account your remorse and lack of previous convictions, I sentence you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. David was led away in handcuffs. He turned to Susan one last time. She didn't look at him. A year after the tragedy, Norfolk slowly returned to normal life. But the Clarks' case changed a lot. Schools introduced anti-bullying and anti-discrimination programs. Pastor Wilson began holding seminars on accepting differences. Dr. Hansen started a free support group for LGBT+ youth. Susan continued to work at the hospital but moved into a small apartment. She sold the house on Corrader Avenue. Too many memories. Once a month, she visited David in prison. Not to reconcile, the wound was too deep, just to make sure he was still alive. Norma's grave was marked by a simple granite stone with the inscription, Norma Clark, beloved daughter, finally home. Detective Maria Rodriguez sometimes drove past the cemetery and saw fresh flowers on the grave. They were usually daffodils, Norma's favorite flowers, her mother had said. Simple, modest, but surprisingly resilient, like the memory of the girl who paid with her life for the right to be herself.